What can I say? Thank you very much, Simon and Ian. The story begins. I've had a continuing preoccupation with the work of prison officers since 1986, when I first set foot in a prison to carry out research. I was helped with my assigned task by an officer working on the gate. It was a small prison, and we ended up talking a lot. He was helpful, and he quietly made everything that needed to happen every day for 8 weeks. So trainees identified, gathered up one by one, delivered to me on time, office space provided, routines established, and the all-important provision of tea. I might not be here today if he hadn't oiled the wheels of that research project when I was an inexperienced research assistant trying to make sense of his world without having the slightest idea how to navigate it. I was surprised by what I saw. Prison officers had not been portrayed in the books I had read as helpful problem solvers. Criminologists pay far more attention to the abuse of power than to its competent, professional, legitimate, or morally intelligible use, and this is a significant oversight. So I'm finally beginning to work out why I'm so interested in the work of prison officers, and the answer has to do with jailcraft. Prison officers at their best model the good use of authority. Authority is something that sociologists and philosophers write huge books about. Here's one huge book I've just read. But they tend to develop negative theories rather than positive, affirming theories. This book by Frank Furedi is one of the best I've read. And in it, he says, authority works only if it has moral meaning. And this is my theme, and I want to come back to it. But first, a little bit of biography. I began my post-school life as a student of politics in York. I fell in love with criminology when I discovered it at master's level and went to Hull University and was invited there to work as a research assistant on the project I've just mentioned. And I've ended up specialising in the study of prisons. My supervisor made me apply to Cambridge to come here to do my PhD in 1987, and I did. And here I am, still, a million years later, still intrigued. In prison officers, I now realise, I could see political philosophy in action, although I didn't work that out at the time. I was just spellbound. And let me explain what I mean in 11 easy steps, starting inside prison. Much of what I say will be elaborated on more slowly by my colleagues as we work our way through these 2 days together. So first, prison officers matter far more than they realise. Just as they constitute 80% of the costs of running a prison, they also make up 80% of the quality as experienced by prisoners. They're not turnkeys, but gatekeepers to goods, services, opportunities, and other people, and they're peacekeepers. They're figures with both moral and instrumental power. They've generally been seriously understudied by prison scholars. We're trying to address this in the Prisons Research Centre, as I hope you'll see. Second, their most important skills are talk and presence of a certain kind. And third, prison officers do things differently. Prisoners and other officers know exactly who the best officers are in an establishment or on their wing. They're sometimes hidden from senior managers because they're on the quieter wings. They take many forms and have different styles, but they share certain qualities. They're neither lax nor over-rule bound. They use their discretion well. We would say for rather than against legitimacy. Fourth, outstanding officers think what they do is common sense. This is wrong. The moment when an outstanding officer takes the temperature down, reduces tension, averts a potential conflict, or persuades an angry prisoner to go to work and resolve his problem the quiet way is the equivalent of a match-winning goal. Except, of course, that nothing has happened. Officers are using the same kind of refined, experience-laden skills that outstanding footballers use when they score goals, and neither is particularly good at describing these highly skilled practices in words. The outstanding outcome for a prison officer, however, is that nothing happens. The day ends peacefully. At the end of a successful day,
a lot of very hard work has had to go into repairing challenges to order, reducing tensions, soothing frustrations, making the regime flow smoothly, sometimes against the odds. This best kind of work is largely invisible, and it's precisely what gets overlooked in most accounts of their work. So prison officers doing this kind of work well are accomplishers rather than keepers of the peace or of order in prison. They don't just keep it, they create it. Its invisibility is the prison officer's tragedy. There's another I shall come to later. So we're really interested in this very hard, barely visible work that goes into ending each day peacefully. Fifth, two good methods for studying the work of prison officers are first, appreciative inquiry. This is a very specific methodology involving asking creative questions or having creative conversations about peak or best experiences. So tell me about the best day you've ever had as a prison officer. What happened? How did it feel? It leads to affirming knowledge. Secondly, shadowing officers in their work. Following officers about reveals a large and interesting gap between what they say about what they do, or the rules, and best practice. So why did you unlock that prisoner when he's not going to work? Well, he's been here a while. I'm keeping an eye on him. He's a bit down. He's no trouble. Officers draw on the rules as a resource, but just like the police, they under-enforce rules that don't work or rules that don't apply in this case. They can't read or memorise all of the instructions directed at them because there are too many and they conflict. So in practice, they rely, and much more than they realise or other people realise, on ideas about order to do their work. A senior manager told me that this finding was highly controversial, but it's empirically true. We observe it. Some of the best work that prison officers do is in this gap. There are also risks here, of course, of bad forms of rule avoiding, not acknowledging or being able to talk about the gap and the best things that can happen in it is a problem. Sixth, when people talk about staff-prisoner relationships being at the heart of the prison system, people say this all the time. What they mean is that staff power works or flows best through relationships. Relationships are the oil that makes the regime flow. And prisoners are more likely to accept this power if it operates through relationships. We saw this most clearly in practice when incentives and earned privileges and volumetric control were introduced, when they were first introduced. Wings where staff-prisoner relationships were good managed quite swift implementation of both. Wings where staff-prisoner relationships were absent or poor experienced kickback. Some prisons lost wings in this process. The types of power that prison officers can use or that are regarded as acceptable by prisoners are linked to the kinds of relationships that they have with prisoners. There's an important distinction we might want to talk about later between good relationships and right relationships. So they need to be good in just the right way. So this statement needs unpicking. I tried to reformulate it in 2011, placing staff professionalism rather than the vague term staff relationships at the heart of everything. Hopefully we'll talk about this later too. Seventh, the best prison officers are what we call moral duelists. That is, they're neither security nor harmony oriented. Most people are one or the other. They're basically conservative or liberal, out or in, self-protecting or egalitarian. And to be both is unusual and it's uncomfortable. And here we have the prison officer's second tragedy. To be good is to be uncomfortable. The best officers manage the tensions between conflicting priorities and values, suicide or escapes, security or order, risk or trust, safety or liberty, rehabilitation or punishment. Most theorists of social order, what we're talking about, write from one or other of these perspectives. And the best imagery that I can use for the good use of authority is something like a ship moving about on waves trying to achieve its ballast, or a pinhead, that actually the right place is a tiny place and the temptation or the energy tends to be to swing from one to the other. Finding the sweet spot between chaos or laxity and over-control is not easy, and it has to be continually worked at. Prisoners are moral duelists. What prisoners want and need, if they're to grow in new directions, is all of it. Stability, clarity, protection and support, decent treatment, and freedom and opportunities. And we found that prisoners develop in ways that lead to longer-term change, so better outcomes, where staff professionalism, humanity, help and assistance, and clarity and organisation are higher. This complicated figure is research-based. It's based on extensive research in 7 prisons, so it's quantitative, it's got figures behind it. I can't go into detail today, so trust me, I'm a doctor. 8th, it gets a bit more complicated here, so bear with me. There are some important but fine distinctions in the work of prison officers. And here are some ideas based on our research findings over the years about different models of order, safety, and professional confidence. I'm only going to pick out one example here, which is the distinctions we found between, if this works, different levels of, different types of safety. So I'm looking at this. So disregard for safety, which is sort of corrupted authority or laxity. Relational safety, which is dynamic and proactive. A shift towards more kind of reassurance or defensive safety, which is more vigilant and suspicious. And then complete lockdown, situational safety. The sweet spot, or the highest level of legitimacy is shown here, is about here at the very far end of what we're calling light present, so light present plus. An underlying feature of these ideal types is the question of whether prison officers have a tragic or a cynical perspective towards prisoners. So William Muir argued in his study of the moral and professional development of police officers that they come to resolve the problem of holding authority, which brings danger, in 2 distinct ways. And out of this, he developed a typology of working styles. One is cynical on this side, so they divide the world into us and them, insulating themselves from moral conflict, and they become either enforcers, doing things by the book, or avoiders, sloping shoulders. The other is tragic, the recognition that we're all flawed and that any of us or our family could end up in prison. One form this perspective takes is dangerous, the reciprocators. These officers are helpers only, and they can't reconcile themselves to the use of power. At their best, officers become professionals, living with the moral complexity of using coercion, knowing that it's an imperfect tool, being prepared to use it rather than either reluctant or over-eager. The professional prison officer doesn't expect perfection either from prisoners or from him or herself, but is reconciled to rather than over-enthusiastic or conflicted about the use of coercion. So if I go back to the complicated figure, my point is really that we should devote more time to identifying, describing and understanding these distinctions because we see them everywhere and we see the different effects of their distribution. And naming and describing them helps to think about and develop them. So 9th, we in the Prisons Research Centre have spent much of our time trying to do this, identify, describe and understand the different ways in which staff operate. And here is our headline result, again based on data. When officers use their authority well, that is, legitimately and carefully, every outcome is improved. Suicide is reduced, violence is reduced, order is improved, something we call political charge, prisoners' anger and alienation is reduced, and even prisoners' futures. So we begin to see a link between these things and reconviction rates. So we found clear evidence of improved, not perfect, improved outcomes on what are linked states and behaviours. There is a plausible explanation for this. Philosophers and psychologists tell us that good order is good for our well-being, our mood, and our personal development or capacity to flourish. This is true for all of us. So, 10, I said at the beginning that prison officers are political philosophers in action. Here's a prisoner talking about fairness. There was a football match. They let us stay up and watch the end of it. And then he's followed by a prison officer talking about the use of discretion. This prisoner wouldn't go to work. I had a chat with him, explained the consequences, left him to it, came back, he went to work. And then a senior manager talking about the importance of exceptions and individuals. And now here's a legal philosopher, Ross Harrison, talking about the important distinction between the mechanical operation of rules and the question of justice in a particular case, what he calls the equality of mercy. He's talking about how complicated but important it is to be able to make exceptions, but to make them in a principled way. You'd know why you let that prisoner out, even though he's not working, and you'd do the same with a like case. You're managing the individual based on knowledge, and you're managing the situation based on a particular model of order which is implicit in your heads. Watching prison officers in action and learning how to conceptualise and measure what you do, partly via how prisoners experience it, has helped us to understand how order, authority and fairness work in the world. And this is something the world needs more of, and certainly something we could do to understand better. So I'm suggesting that the work of prison officers has a relevance beyond the prison. My last point is this. A key challenge of being a prison officer is uncannily like the challenge of research. Officers have to read the situation right, to see what's really going on in a situation. This is another philosopher, Iris Murdoch. Reading the situation right is a highly skilled and delicate art, particularly for you as the prison population grows in size and it changes in composition. It takes us and our team considerable time and effort to read a prison well. It's a learned skill. We're quite good at it collectively now, but we still find it a challenge. Officers do more than this in also having to respond accordingly. Reading the situation right and responding accordingly saves lives. So, to conclude and recap, this quote, I think, summarises my argument. And what I wanted to do was just get you to think about the differences between an outstanding doctor, for example, and the rest. The best doctors have technical competence, moral integrity, and good interpersonal skills. Taken together, these qualities can save lives. They notice more, and patients trust them. Research shows that patients recover faster as a result. In just the same way, a good prison needs professionally competent staff. My point is that there's more to good prison officer work than meets the eye. I'm going to explode, I think. My 18 minutes is up. It's work with considerable moral meaning. We need to speak this language of power and pay much more attention to what this work looks like at its best. That's my timer. Thank you very much for listening.